The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and hope, but when I woke up, it was just antiseptic. My eyes blinked open to a sterile white ceiling, the kind that makes you feel like you're nowhere. I'd been up all night, holding her hand through the screams and the tears, watching our son come into the world. His tiny cry had filled the room, and I laughed, exhausted, thinking this was it, the start of everything. But now, the crib next to the bed was empty. No blanket, no little hat, no baby. I sat up, my heart doing a slow thud against my ribs. The chair where she'd been was empty too. No bag, no jacket, nothing. Just a folded hospital gown on the seat, like she'd never been there at all. I called her name, Alyssa, softly at first, thinking maybe she was in the bathroom. No answer. I swung my legs off the bed, ignoring the ache in my back, and checked the hallway. Nurses bustled past, but none of them were her. I grabbed my phone from the side table. No messages. No missed calls. Just a picture of us from last month, her smiling with that glow, me with my arm around her, both of us looking like we had it all figured out. I dialed her number. Straight to voicemail. My stomach twisted, not yet panic, but something close. Maybe she took the baby for a checkup? I shuffled to the nurse's station, my socks sliding on the cold floor. The woman behind the desk looked up, her face kind but tired. I asked about my wife, my son. Her fingers tapped the keyboard, and then she frowned. She checked out a few hours ago, she said, like it was nothing. Said she was feeling fine and took the baby home. Home? We hadn't talked about leaving. I'd been right here, sleeping off the longest night of my life. The drive back to our place was a blur. I kept glancing at the empty car seat in the back, the one we'd picked out together at the store, arguing over colors like it was the biggest decision we'd ever make. The house was quiet when I got there. Too quiet. The nursery door was open, the crib untouched, the little stuffed bear I'd bought still sitting on the shelf. I called her name again, louder this time, my voice bouncing off the walls. Nothing. I checked every room, every closet, even the garage, like maybe she was hiding somewhere, playing a cruel joke. But the truth was settling in, heavy and cold. She was gone. Our son was gone. No note, no text, no explanation. Just me, standing in a house that didn't feel like mine anymore. I called the police that afternoon. The officer who came by was polite but skeptical, scribbling notes as I tried to explain that my wife wouldn't just leave. Sometimes new moms get overwhelmed, he said, like that was supposed to make sense. I showed him the hospital discharge papers, the ones I'd found crumpled in the trash. He promised to file a missing persons report, but warned me it might not go far. She was an adult, after all, and she'd taken the baby legally. Legally. The word stuck in my throat like a bone. I spent the next few days calling hospitals, friends, her coworkers, anyone who might know something. Nobody did. Her phone stayed off. Her social media was silent. It was like she'd vanished into thin air, and I was left chasing a ghost. Weeks dragged by, each one heavier than the last. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating much. The nursery stayed untouched, a museum of what could have been. My neighbor Priya started coming by, bringing coffee and forcing me to talk. She'd been a nurse once, knew how hospitals worked, and she didn't sugarcoat things. She didn't just disappear, she said one night, sitting on my couch with a laptop open. People don't vanish like that unless they want to. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was piling up. Alyssa's clothes were gone from the closet. Her favorite mug wasn't in the sink. Little things I hadn't noticed at first, things that said she'd planned this. Then the letter came. It was in a crisp white envelope, the kind lawyers used to make bad news look professional. I opened it at the kitchen table, my hands shaking. It was from an attorney, some woman named Janelle Carver, representing Alyssa. The words blurred together: child support, immediate financial assistance, sole custody. My wife, who'd walked out without a word, was now asking for money. For our son, who I hadn't seen since the hospital. I read it 3 times, waiting for it to make sense. It didn't. I called Priya, and she was there in 10 minutes, reading the letter over my shoulder. "This is bold," she said, her voice sharp. "She leaves you, takes your kid, and now this?" I didn't know what to say. Anger was there, sure, but it was buried under something deeper, betrayal, maybe, or just plain confusion. I met with a guy named Silas the next day. Priya knew him, said he was good with legal stuff, even if he wasn't exactly a lawyer. He had a beard and a way of talking that cut through the fog in my head. "First thing," he said, leaning across a diner table, "you don't pay a dime until you know where your son is." He told me to gather everything: bank statements, texts, anything that might show what she'd been up to. I didn't know where to start, but I nodded anyway. That night, I sat in the nursery, staring at the empty crib. I could still hear his cry from that first night, so small but so alive. I didn't know where he was, didn't know if he was safe. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let her win. Not like this. I grabbed my laptop and started digging, pulling up old emails, checking accounts we'd shared. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The hospital, the letter, the silence, it was all starting to feel like a puzzle, and I was going to figure it out piece by piece, no matter how long it took. The courthouse smelled like old wood and desperation, the kind of place where dreams go to get crushed under paperwork. I sat on a hard bench outside the courtroom, my tie feeling too tight, my palms sweaty against the folder in my lap. It had been weeks since the letter arrived, weeks since I learned Alyssa was alive and demanding money like she hadn't ripped my world apart. I hadn't seen her since the hospital, hadn't heard her voice, hadn't even gotten a picture of our son. And now I was here, summoned to family court, expected to play along with whatever game she was running. The hallway was cold, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, making everything feel like a bad dream. People shuffled past, lawyers with briefcases, couples whispering, a guy in a cheap suit wiping his eyes. I kept my head down, trying to focus on the sound of my own breathing, anything to keep the anger from boiling over. Priya had driven me here, mostly because she didn't trust me to keep it together on my own. She was waiting in the parking lot, probably scrolling through her phone, ready to grill me the second I got out. "Don't let her get in your head," she'd said before I walked in. Easier said than done. The folder in my hands held everything I'd managed to scrape together: bank statements, the hospital discharge papers, a copy of the missing persons report. It wasn't much, but Silas had told me to bring it anyway. Judges like paper, he'd said over coffee yesterday. Doesn't matter if it's weak. It shows you're not just sitting there. I wasn't sure I believed him, but I didn't have anything else to hold on to. The bailiff called my name, and my stomach lurched. I stood, smoothing my jacket, and walked into the courtroom. It was smaller than I'd expected, more like a meeting room than the dramatic scenes you see on TV. The judge's bench loomed at the front, empty for now. A few people sat scattered in the pews, a clerk typing, a couple of bored-looking attorneys, and then, there she was. Alyssa. She was sitting at a table on the left, her hair pulled back, her face calm, like she was waiting for a dentist appointment. She didn't look at me, not even a glance. She wore a dark blazer, the kind you buy to look serious, and her hands were folded neatly in front of her. Next to her was a woman in a sharp suit, her lawyer, I guessed. They were whispering, heads close, like they were sharing a secret. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to walk to the other table, where I'd be sitting alone. No lawyer yet, Silas had said I didn't need one for this hearing, just to listen and not lose my cool. The judge came in, a man with gray hair and a face that looked like it hadn't smiled in years. His nameplate read Judge Rayland Kerr. Everyone stood, then sat, and the room went quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. The clerk read some case number, and then Alyssa's lawyer stood up. She introduced herself as Janelle Carver, her voice smooth and practiced, like she'd done this 1,000 times. She started talking about Alyssa, calling her a devoted mother who'd been left with no choice after a difficult postpartum period. I stared at the table, my jaw clenched so hard it hurt. Difficult postpartum period? She'd walked out of the hospital without a word, taken our son, and disappeared. But the lawyer kept going, painting a picture of a struggling mom who couldn't work, who needed support to provide a stable home for the baby. She said I'd been uninvolved, that I'd failed to step up. Every word was a punch, but I didn't move, didn't react. Silas had warned me about this. Let them talk. Let them think they're winning. Then came the numbers. Janelle Carver slid a document across to the judge, listing what Alyssa wanted. Child support, starting immediately, plus back pay for the months since she'd left. The amount made my head spin, more than I could afford, more than anyone could expect from a guy who'd just lost everything. She said Alyssa had no means to work because of emotional and physical strain. I wanted to laugh, but it caught in my throat. No means to work? I didn't know where she'd been, what she'd been doing, but I knew one thing. She wasn't the victim here. The judge nodded, scribbling something, his face unreadable. He asked if I had anything to say. I stood, my legs shaky, and cleared my throat. "Your Honor," I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. "I haven't seen my son since the day he was born. She left without telling me. I don't even know where they are." It wasn't much, but it was the truth. The judge looked at me for a long moment. then turned back to the lawyer. "We'll schedule a follow-up," he said, and that was it. Court adjourned. I walked out feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. Alyssa was already gone, her lawyer trailing behind her, their heels clicking on the floor. She hadn't said a word to me, hadn't even looked my way. I stood in the hallway, the folder still in my hands, wondering what I was supposed to do now. My phone buzzed. Priya, asking if I was okay. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The anger was there now, hot and sharp, but it wasn't just anger. It was the way she'd sat there, so smug, so sure she'd get what she wanted. Like I was nothing, like what she'd done didn't matter. I thought about our son, wherever he was, and my hands tightened on the folder. I didn't have a plan, not really, but I knew I wasn't going to let this end here. I'd go back to the house, dig deeper, find something, anything, that could show the judge who she really was. The hearing was over, but this wasn't. Not by a long shot. I headed for the exit, the courthouse still buzzing around me, and stepped into the daylight, ready to fight for the truth, whatever it took. The courtroom felt tighter today, like the walls were pressing in, or maybe it was just the weight of everything piling up. I sat at my table, same spot as before, my hands folded to keep them from shaking. The air smelled like stale coffee and floor polish, and the hum of whispers filled the room. Lawyers, clerks, a few strangers in the back who I didn't recognize. Alyssa was already there when I walked in, sitting with her lawyer, her face a mask of confidence. She wore a different blazer today, gray instead of black, and her hair was pinned up like she'd spent hours getting ready. She didn't look at me, same as last time, but I could feel the energy coming off her, smug, like she thought she'd already won. I kept my eyes on the judge's empty bench, trying to stay calm, but my pulse was hammering in my ears. This was the follow-up hearing, the one where things were supposed to get decided, and I still didn't have enough to fight her with. Just a folder of papers, a few bank statements, and a missing persons report that hadn't led anywhere. Judge Kerr walked in, and everyone stood, the room going quiet except for the rustle of papers. He settled into his chair, his face as unreadable as ever, and nodded for the clerk to start. Alyssa's lawyer, Janelle Carver, stood first, smoothing her skirt before launching into her speech. She went on about financial hardship and maternal sacrifice, same as last time, but now she had a stack of documents to back it up, letters from a doctor I'd never heard of, some kind of income statement that showed Alyssa had nothing. It was all so polished, so rehearsed, like they'd spent weeks building a story where I was the bad guy. I listened, my jaw tight, waiting for my turn to say something, anything, but the judge just kept writing, his pen scratching louder than it should have been. Then Alyssa spoke. Janelle asked her to explain her situation, and she stood, her voice soft but clear, like she was reading from a script. "I've been struggling," she said, her eyes fixed somewhere above the judge's head. "I don't have a job right now, and I'm doing everything I can to take care of our son. It's been hard, being alone, with no support." She paused, letting the words hang, and I felt my stomach twist. Alone? No support? She'd walked out, taken our son, and left me with nothing but questions. But she wasn't done. She turned slightly, not looking at me, and said, "I don't have a job, so I won't stop leeching off you." The words landed like a slap, sharp and deliberate, and then the room exploded. Laughter, loud, sudden, from the back row where a few of her friends were sitting. They covered their mouths, but it was too late. Even Janelle Carver froze, her face twitching like she wanted to disappear. The judge banged his gavel, once, hard, and the noise stopped. But the air was different now, charged with something I couldn't name. I sat there, stunned, my hands gripping the edge of the table. "Leeching off you." She'd said it out loud, in front of everyone, like it was a joke. Like humiliating me was the point. The laughter was gone, but it echoed in my head, mixing with the memory of that empty crib, the hospital room, the weeks of silence. I wanted to stand up, to yell, to tell the judge she was lying, that she'd planned this, that she didn't care about our son. She just wanted to hurt me. But I didn't. I stayed quiet, my breath shallow, because Silas had drilled it into me. Don't react. Don't give them anything. The judge was watching now, his eyes moving between Alyssa and her lawyer, who was whispering something to her, probably begging her to shut up. Alyssa sat down, her face red but still defiant, like she didn't care what anyone thought. The hearing moved on, but I barely heard it. Janelle tried to recover, talking about emotional context and stress, but the judge wasn't listening as closely anymore. He asked a few questions about Alyssa's living situation, about where the baby was staying, and her answers were vague, too vague. I could tell he noticed, because his pen stopped moving and he leaned back, his eyes narrowing. My turn came, and I stood, my voice steadier than I expected. Your Honor, I said, I don't know where my son is. I haven't seen him since the hospital. She left without telling me, and now she's asking for money, but I don't even know if he's safe. It wasn't much, but it was honest, and for the first time, I felt like someone was listening. The judge nodded, just once, and said we'd reconvene in a week. Another delay, another day of waiting, but it didn't feel like a loss this time. I walked out of the courtroom, my folder under my arm, the laughter still ringing in my ears. Alyssa and her lawyer were gone before I reached the hallway, probably off to regroup, to figure out how to spin this. I didn't care. Something had shifted in there, something I could use. She'd shown herself, just for a second, and I wasn't going to let it go. I headed home, the drive a blur of red lights and half-formed thoughts. Priya was waiting at my place, like always, her laptop open on the kitchen table. How'd it go? She asked, but I didn't answer right away. I dropped the folder and started talking about the laughter, about what Alyssa had said, about the way the judge had looked at her. Priya listened, her eyes sharp, and when I was done, she leaned back and said, she's digging her own grave. You just need to keep pushing. That night, I sat in my office, the house dark except for the glow of my computer screen. I'd been documenting everything, just like Silas told me to, every call to the police, every email I'd sent, every receipt I could find. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was something. I pulled up our old bank statements, the ones from before she left, and started scrolling. There were charges I hadn't noticed before, small ones, gas stations, coffee shops, places I didn't recognize. I wrote them down, my pen moving faster now, my mind racing. She'd been so sure in that courtroom, so certain I'd just roll over. But I wasn't that guy anymore. I was the guy who'd heard her laugh, who'd seen her slip, and I was going to make sure everyone else saw it too. The clock ticked past midnight, but I didn't stop. Every detail, every moment, she thought I'd missed it all, but I hadn't. I was watching now, and I wasn't going to blink. The house was too quiet tonight, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears until you can hear your own heartbeat. I sat in my office, a small room at the back of the place, surrounded by stacks of papers and a computer screen that was starting to blur from hours of staring. The desk lamp cast a harsh circle of light, making the rest of the room feel like it was hiding something. I'd been at it since I got home from the courthouse, Alyssa's words still looping in my head. Leeching off you, she'd said, and the laughter that followed had cut deeper than I wanted to admit. But I wasn't here to feel sorry for myself. I was here to find answers, to piece together what she'd been doing all these months. Because one thing was clear, she hadn't just walked out on a whim. She'd planned it, and I was going to prove it. Priya showed up around 7, letting herself in with the spare key I'd given her weeks ago. She dropped a bag of takeout on the kitchen counter and came straight to the office, her sneakers squeaking on the hardwood. You look like you haven't slept in a year, she said, leaning against the door frame. I didn't argue. My eyes were gritty, my shoulders ached, and the coffee mug next to me was cold. She didn't wait for an invite, just pulled up a chair and started flipping through the papers I'd spread out, bank statements, hospital forms, even a parking ticket I'd found in the glove box of her old car. What are we looking for? She asked, her voice sharp, like she was ready to fight someone. I told her about the courtroom, about Alyssa's smugness, about the way she'd laughed like this was all a game. Priya's jaw tightened, but she didn't say anything, just nodded and grabbed a highlighter. Let's find something she can't laugh off, she said. We started with the bank records, the ones from the joint account we'd shared before she left. I hadn't looked at them closely back then. Money was her thing, always had been. She'd pay the bills, handle the budget, and I'd trusted her. Stupid, maybe, but I hadn't thought twice about it until. Priya was better at this than me, her years as a nurse making her good at spotting patterns. She pointed out a string of withdrawals, small ones, starting 3 months before the baby was born. $50 here, $100 there, always cash, always at ATMs I didn't recognize. This isn't normal, she said, circling one from a gas station 2 towns over. Who needs cash this often? I didn't have an answer, but it felt like a thread, something to pull on. Then there was the medical stuff. Alyssa had told the court she'd been too emotionally strained to work, but I found a reimbursement check from her insurance, dated a month before she left. It was for a doctor's visit I didn't remember, some specialist in another county. I called the office the next day, pretending to be confused about a bill, but they wouldn't tell me much, just that the visit had been for routine care. Routine care, my foot. She'd been healthy, glowing, telling everyone how excited she was about the baby. Priya dug deeper, using her old hospital contacts to pull some strings. Nothing concrete yet, but she got a name, a clinic that didn't match the one Alyssa had been going to for checkups. It was another piece, small but heavy. Silas called later that night, his voice crackling through the phone like he was pacing outside somewhere. I'd sent him pictures of what we'd found, and he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. "This is good," he said, "but it's not enough. You need a story, not just receipts. Something that ties it together." He told me to keep digging, to look for anything that showed intent, emails, texts, even mail she might have hidden. "She's playing defense," he said. "You need to go on offense." I didn't know what that meant yet, but it stuck with me like a challenge I couldn't ignore. Before he hung up, he added, "And don't let her get in your head. She wants you angry. Angry people make mistakes." I didn't sleep much after that. The office became my world, the papers and screen my only company once Priya went home. I started checking other things, her old laptop, the one she'd left in the closet, still logged into our shared cloud account. Most of it was junk, but there was a folder labeled baby stuff that caught my eye. Inside were scans of documents, our son's birth certificate, his social security card, even a hospital wristband. But the address on the certificate wasn't ours. It was a P.O. box in a town I'd never heard of, 2 states away. My hands went cold as I stared at it. She'd changed it, rerouted it, like she was erasing us from his life. I printed it out, added it to the pile, and kept going. By morning, I had a timeline, rough but real. Withdrawals, doctor visits, that P.O. box, it was starting to look like she'd been building a secret life long before the hospital. Priya came back with coffee and bagels, her eyes scanning the new papers I'd pinned to a corkboard. "You're scary when you're focused," she said, half laughing, but I could tell she was impressed. We cross-checked dates, matching withdrawals to places she'd been. One stood out, a hotel charge, 2 weeks before the birth, in a city she'd never mentioned visiting. It wasn't much, but it was something she couldn't explain away. I could feel it now, the truth getting closer, like a shadow moving into the light. I leaned back in my chair, my neck stiff, and looked at the board. It wasn't just about money or custody anymore. It was about our son, about where he was, about why she'd done this. Every receipt, every date, every lie, it was a step toward him. I didn't know what I'd find next, but I knew I wasn't stopping. Alyssa thought she could laugh this off, thought I'd give up. She was wrong. I closed the laptop, grabbed another stack of papers, and started again, the quiet of the house no longer heavy but alive with purpose. I was building something now, something she couldn't ignore, and when the time came, I'd be ready to show it all. The air in the house felt thick today, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. I sat at the kitchen table, the surface cluttered with papers and a half-empty coffee mug, staring at the letter that had arrived yesterday. It was from Alyssa's lawyer, Janelle Carver, all crisp and official, offering me a settlement. The words were polite but cold: visitation rights for our son, twice a month, supervised, in exchange for a monthly child support payment that made my stomach drop. They'd even thrown in phrases like emotional trauma and economic disparity to justify it, as if I was the one who'd walked out. I hadn't slept much since it came, just kept reading it over and over, looking for a trap. It was the day before the final hearing, and this was their last move: pressure me to sign, to give in, to let Alyssa walk away with everything. But I wasn't signing. Not yet. Not ever, if I could help it. Priya had been over earlier, pacing the kitchen while I read her the letter. "They're scared," she'd said, her voice sharp with conviction. "If they had this locked up, they wouldn't be offering you anything." She was probably right, but it didn't make the decision easier. Visitation sounded good, 2 days a month with my son, a chance to see his face, to know he was okay. But it also meant agreeing to her terms, letting her control the story, letting her win. I couldn't shake the memory of her in court, laughing, calling me a leech, like this was all a game to her. Every time I thought about signing, I saw that empty crib in the hospital, felt that silence when I came home to nothing. No, I wasn't giving her what she wanted. Not without a fight. Silas called around noon, his voice calm but urgent, like he knew I was teetering. "Don't sign anything," he said before I could even explain. "They're trying to lock you in before you show what you've got." What I've got. That was the problem. I'd spent weeks digging bank statements, that P.O. box, the hotel charge, the fake doctor's visits, but it wasn't enough to prove anything big, not yet. Silas didn't care. "You've got more than you think," he said. "Judges don't like surprises, and you're about to surprise the hell out of them." He told me to bring everything to the hearing, every scrap, every note, and to keep my mouth shut until the right moment. "You're not the guy who folds," he said, and hung up before I could argue. I stood up, my chair scraping the floor, and went in my office. The corkboard on the wall was a mess of papers and sticky notes. My timeline of Alyssa's moves pinned up like a map of a crime scene. I'd added more since last night. A receipt from a diner near that hotel. A screenshot of an email she'd sent to someone about new plans a month before she left. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was something. I pulled a folder from the desk when I hadn't shown Priya or Silas yet. Inside was a single page, a copy of a form I'd found on her old laptop, buried in a folder she probably thought I'd never check. It was an application for a new mailing address, dated the week before our son was born. Not the P.O. box, that was separate. This was a real address, a house in another state, listed under her maiden name. I didn't know what it meant yet, but it felt like a secret she didn't want me to find. I tucked the folder into my bag, the one I'd take to court tomorrow. It was heavy now, stuffed with everything I'd gathered, but that one page felt heavier than the rest. I could still hear Silas's voice. "Don't play defense. Go on offense." He was right. I'd been reacting this whole time, scrambling to keep up, but tomorrow was different. Tomorrow, I'd be the one with something to say. I walked to the living room, the house still quiet, and stood in front of the nursery door. I hadn't gone in there much since she left, hadn't been able to face the crib, the stuffed bear, the empty space where our son should have been. But tonight, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room smelled like dust and memories, and for a second, I could almost hear his cry from that first night. So small but so real. I touched the crib, my fingers brushing the wood, and made a promise, not to him, not to myself, but to the truth. I was going to bring him home. The rest of the day was a blur. I ironed my shirt, polished my shoes, went over my notes one last time. Priya texted, asking if I needed her to come with me tomorrow, but I told her no. This was something I had to do alone. She didn't argue, just sent back a thumbs up and "You got this." I wasn't so sure, but I wanted to believe her. By evening, I was back at the kitchen table, the settlement letter still sitting there, mocking me. I picked it up, read it again, then folded it and set it aside. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about Alyssa thinking she could erase me, thinking she could take my son and leave me with nothing but a bill. She was wrong. I went to bed early, or tried to. The ceiling stared back at me, and my mind kept running through tomorrow, what I'd say, how the judge would look, whether Alyssa would laugh again. I thought about that folder in my bag, about the address I'd found, about all the pieces I'd been collecting. They weren't enough to win, not on their own, but they were enough to start something. Enough to make her sweat. I closed my eyes, picturing my son's face, the way his tiny hand had curled around my finger in the hospital. That was why I was doing this. Not for revenge, not for pride, but for him. Tomorrow, I'd walk into that courtroom, and I wouldn't be the guy who'd woken up to an empty crib. I'd be the guy who fought back, who held on to the truth when everything else was gone. The clock ticked past midnight, and I finally drifted off, my bag by the door, my promise still burning, ready for the morning when everything would change. The courtroom smelled the same, old wood, stale air, a hint of someone's cologne gone sour, but it felt different today, like the air was heavier, waiting for something to snap. I sat at my table, my hand steady on the folder in front of me, the one I'd packed last night with every piece of paper I thought might matter. My tie was straight, my shirt pressed, but inside, my heart was pounding so hard I thought the bailiff might hear it. Alyssa was already there, sitting with Janelle Carver at their table, her face calm, almost bored, like she was sure this was just a formality. She hadn't looked at me, not once, not even when I walked in and took my seat. Her lawyer was flipping through papers, whispering something, and I caught a glimpse of Alyssa nodding, a small smile tugging at her lips. That smile, it was the same one from the last hearing, the one that came right before she'd laughed and called me a leech. It made my skin crawl, but I kept my eyes on the judge's bench, waiting for the moment I'd been building toward. Judge Kerr came in, his robe swishing as he settled into his chair, and the room went quiet. He looked tired, his eyes scanning the courtroom like he was already done with us. The clerk read the case number, and Janelle stood first, her voice as smooth as ever. She started with the same story, poor Alyssa, struggling mom, abandoned by an uninvolved father who refused to step up. She went on about emotional detachment, said I'd shown no effort to find my son, no willingness to support him. It was a lie, every word, but she sold it like it was gospel, sliding documents across to the judge to prove her point. Bank statements, supposedly showing I had money to spare, a letter from some therapist claiming Alyssa was under severe stress. I listened, my jaw tight, my fingers pressing into the folder. She was good, I'd give her that. But she didn't know what I had. Not yet. The judge nodded, scribbling something, then looked at Alyssa. Anything to add? He asked. She stood, her hands clasped in front of her, and started talking soft, rehearsed, like she'd practiced in front of a mirror. I just want what's best for our son, she said, her voice catching just enough to sound sincere. I've been alone, trying to make ends meet, and he hasn't helped at all. I need support to give our baby a good life. It was perfect, almost. The judge was listening, the clerk was typing, and for a second, I could see why she thought she'd won. She sat down, her lawyer patting her arm, and the room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. My turn was coming, and I could feel the weight of it, heavy but not crushing. Not anymore. Judge Kerr turned to me, his pen still in hand. Mr. Rowan, any final remarks? He asked, his tone flat, like he wasn't expecting much. I stood, my legs steady, and took a breath. Actually, Your Honor, I said, my voice clearer than I'd hoped. I have something to add. The words hung there, sharp and deliberate, and for the first time, I saw Alyssa glance my way, just a flicker, her smile gone. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder, the one I'd been carrying like a lifeline. I'd like to submit some documents, I said, stepping forward to hand them to the clerk. The judge raised an eyebrow but nodded, and the clerk passed the folder up to him. I stayed standing, my hands at my sides, watching as he opened it and started flipping through. The room was quiet now, so quiet I could hear the pages turning. I'd spent weeks putting that folder together, bank transfers from our joint account to one I didn't recognize, starting months before she left. Receipts from a hotel she'd never told me about, that P.O. box address on our son's birth certificate, filed without my knowledge. There was more, timestamps from a gas station camera near that hotel, showing her car the week before she disappeared, an affidavit from a woman who worked at a daycare, saying she'd seen Alyssa drop our son off at her cousin's house a week after the hospital, then leave town for days. I'd found her through Priya's contacts, a long shot that paid off. And then there was the email, the one I'd pulled from her old laptop, where she'd written to someone about starting fresh and making sure he doesn't follow. It wasn't a confession, but it was close enough. The judge's face didn't change much, but his eyebrows kept climbing, page after page. Janelle Carver was on her feet now, saying something about unverified documents and proper procedure, but her voice was shaky, like she hadn't seen this coming. Alyssa wasn't smiling anymore. She was staring at the table, her hands gripping each other so tight her knuckles were white. I didn't look at her for long. I didn't need to. The judge held up a hand, cutting Janelle off, and kept reading. These are interesting, he said finally, his voice low, like he was talking to himself. He set the folder down and looked at me. You're saying the show's intent to deceive? I nodded. Yes, Your Honor. She didn't just leave. She planned it, and she's been lying about where our son is. It was the truth, plain and simple, and saying it out loud felt like letting go of something I'd been carrying too long. The judge leaned back, his eyes moving to Alyssa's table. Counselor, he said to Janelle, do you have a response to this? She stammered, asking for time to review, saying the documents needed verification, but the judge wasn't having it. You've had weeks to present your case, he said. I'll take these under advisement. We'll reconvene tomorrow. He banged his gavel, and just like that, it was over for now. I stood there, my legs suddenly heavy, as the room started to empty. Alyssa was whispering to her lawyer, her face pale, but I didn't stick around to watch. I grabbed my bag and walked out, the folder still with the judge, my hands empty but my chest lighter than it had been in months. The hallway was bright, the sunlight streaming through a window, and for the first time, I felt like I'd done something real. Not enough to win, not yet, but enough to make them listen. I could still hear Silas's voice in my head. Go on offense. I had. And tomorrow, I'd do it again, whatever it took to get my son back. The courthouse hallway felt colder today, like the chill had settled into the walls overnight. I stood outside the courtroom, my hands in my pockets, trying to keep my nerves in check. Yesterday had been big, handing over that folder, watching Alyssa's face change, seeing the judge actually listen, but it wasn't over. The hearing was set to pick up where we'd left off, and I could feel the tension building, like a storm waiting to break. My bag was lighter now, just a notepad and a few copies of what I'd already given the judge, but it didn't matter. What I'd started yesterday was out there now, and there was no taking it back. I didn't want to. For the first time in months, I wasn't just reacting, I was pushing forward, and it felt good, even if it scared me half to death. The bailiff called us in, and I took my seat, the same hard chair at the same scratched table. Alyssa was there, looking smaller somehow, her eyes fixed on her hands. No smile today, no whispers with her lawyer. Janelle Carver sat next to her, flipping through a binder, her face tight like she'd been up all night. The back row was emptier, no friends laughing this time. The judge came in, and we all stood, the room settling into that heavy silence that comes before something big. Judge Kerr didn't waste time. He opened my folder, still on his bench from yesterday, and started talking. "We have some serious allegations here," he said, his voice slow, deliberate. "Documents suggesting premeditation, possible misrepresentation of circumstances. I'd like to hear from both sides." Janelle was up first, and she came out swinging, but it wasn't like before. Her voice was sharp, almost desperate, saying my documents were unsubstantiated and presented without context. She called the bank transfers routine, the P.O. box a clerical error, the daycare affidavit hearsay. But the judge wasn't nodding like he had at the last hearing. He was watching her, his pen still, and when she tried to pivot back to Alyssa's hardship, he cut her off. "We'll get to that," he said. "I'm more interested in these discrepancies." Discrepancies. The word landed like a stone, and I saw Alyssa shift in her seat, her hands twisting together. I kept my face still, but inside, I was holding my breath. Then it got worse for her. The judge called for a recess, just 10 minutes, and when we came back, there was someone new in the room, a woman in a plain suit, standing near the clerk's desk. The judge introduced her as Eva Reinhardt, from Child Protective Services. My stomach twisted, not sure if this was good or bad, but Silas had warned me CPS might get involved if things got messy. Eva stepped forward, holding a thin file, and started talking. She said they'd done a preliminary inquiry based on my affidavit about the daycare worker. What she said next hit like a punch. Our son hadn't been with Alyssa since the second week after she left the hospital. He'd been staying with Alyssa's cousin, in a house 2 hours away, under unclear circumstances. The cousin had told CPS she thought Alyssa was taking a break and would be back soon. A break. I stared at the table, my hands clenching, trying to process it. My son, my boy, left with someone else while Alyssa played victim in court. The judge asked Eva if Alyssa had been in contact with the cousin recently. "Not according to our records," she said. "The last call was over a month ago." The room felt like it was tilting. I glanced at Alyssa, and she was frozen, her face pale, her eyes wide like she'd been caught in a trap she didn't see coming. Janelle tried to jump in, saying this was new information, and they needed time to respond, but the judge wasn't having it. "You've had time," he said, his voice harder now. He turned to me, asking if I had anything to add. I stood, my throat dry, and said, "I just want to know where my son is, Your Honor." I didn't know any of this until now. It was the truth, and it came out quieter than I meant, but it felt like enough. Then Silas texted me. He'd been waiting outside, keeping tabs through a friend in the clerk's office. "Check the Venmo," he wrote. I'd almost forgotten about that. Last week, Priya had found a public Venmo account linked to Alyssa, one she hadn't hidden well. There were payments, small but regular, to a guy named Darian Locke, hundreds of dollars over the past few months, labeled things like dinner or gas. I'd printed the transactions, just in case, and they were in my bag. I didn't know who Darian was, but Silas had a hunch he wasn't just a friend. I pulled the printout and asked to approach, my hand steady now. "Your Honor," I said, "I found these payments from her account after she claimed she had no money. I think they're relevant." The judge took the paper, his eyes scanning it, and I saw Janelle's face go white. Alyssa didn't move, didn't breathe, like she was waiting for the floor to swallow her. The judge set the paper down and looked at Alyssa's table. "Counselor," he said, "this is starting to look like a pattern. I'm going to need some answers." Janelle stammered, asking for a continuance, but the judge shook his head. "We're not done here," he said, and called another recess, this one longer. He wanted CPS to verify Eva's report by tomorrow. I walked out, my head spinning, the hallway brighter than it should have been. Silas was waiting by the vending machines, his beard scruffier than usual, a grin on his face. "You did it," he said, clapping my shoulder. "You cracked her wide open." I didn't feel like celebrating. My son was with some cousin I'd never met, and Alyssa had been lying about everything, where she was, what she was doing, who she was with. I didn't know Darian Locke, but I was starting to think he was the reason she'd left, the reason she'd taken my boy and tried to bleed me dry. I drove home alone, the radio off, my mind racing. The house was quiet when I got there, but it didn't feel empty anymore. I went to my office, pulled out my laptop, and started searching for Darian Locke. Social media, public records, anything I could find. There wasn't much, just a blurry photo on a friend's page, a guy with a smirk, standing too close to Alyssa at what looked like a bar. It wasn't proof, but it was something, and I was done letting her secrets stay buried. Tomorrow, the judge would hear more, and I'd be there, ready to push harder, ready to bring my son home where he belonged. The courtroom was quieter than usual, like everyone knew something big was coming. I sat at my table, my hands resting on a single notepad, my bag empty now that the judge had all my documents. Yesterday had shaken things up, Eva from CPS, those Venmo payments, Alyssa's face when she realized her story was unraveling. I hadn't slept much, just lay in bed thinking about my son, stuck with some cousin I didn't know, while Alyssa played her games. Today was an emergency session, called late last night after CPS asked for an immediate custody review. The word emergency kept rattling in my head, half hope, half dread, but I was here, ready to see this through, whatever it meant. The room filled slowly, fewer people in the back, no sign of Alyssa's friends. She was already at her table when I walked in, her head down, her lawyer flipping through papers like she was searching for a miracle. Janelle Carver looked tired, her suit a little wrinkled, like she'd been up as late as I had. Alyssa wasn't talking, wasn't moving, just staring at the table like it might save her. I didn't look at her for long. My focus was on the judge's bench, on what would happen when he walked in. I could still hear Silas's voice from last night, over the phone, "Stay calm, but don't back down. You've got her on the ropes." I wasn't sure I believed him, but I wanted to. For my son, I had to. Judge Kerr came in, his face grimmer than before, and we all stood, the air tight with anticipation. He didn't bother with formalities, just nodded to the clerk and said, "Let's get started." Eva Reinhardt was back, standing near the front with a thicker file this time. The judge called her forward, and she started talking, her voice steady but heavy. CPS had visited the cousin's house yesterday, she said. My son was there, safe, but the situation wasn't right. The cousin, a woman named Tara, had no legal paperwork, no permission to keep him long-term. She told CPS she thought Alyssa was figuring things out and would come back eventually. Eventually. The word burned in my chest. My boy, left like luggage, while Alyssa was here, lying about being a devoted mom. Eva kept going. Tara had shown them text messages from Alyssa, promising to pick up our son soon, but the last one was weeks old. There were no doctor visits, no daycare records, nothing to show Alyssa had been involved since dropping him off. The judge's pen stopped moving, his eyes narrowing as Eva handed him a report. "We have concerns about parental fitness," she said, and I felt the room shift, like the ground was moving under Alyssa's feet. Janelle jumped up, her voice loud, saying this was premature and unfair, demanding a chance to respond. But the judge raised a hand, silencing her. "You'll get your turn," he said, and turned back to Eva. "What's the child's current status?" Eva said he was still with Tara for now, but CPS was recommending a temporary placement with a family member who could provide stability, meaning me, if I was willing. Willing. The word almost made me laugh. I'd been willing since the day he was born, since the moment I saw his tiny face in the hospital. I stood when the judge asked if I had anything to say, my voice steady despite the knot in my throat. "Your Honor," I said, "I didn't know where my son was until yesterday. I've been trying to find him since she left. I'm ready to take him home, to give him what he needs." It wasn't a speech, just the truth, but it felt like it landed. The judge nodded, scribbling something, then looked at Alyssa's table. "Counselor," he said. Janelle tried to pivot, saying Alyssa had been under extreme stress and had made arrangements for our son's care. But the judge wasn't buying it. He started asking questions, hard ones. Where had Alyssa been living? Why hadn't she contacted CPS? What about the Venmo payments to Darian Locke? Janelle stumbled, saying the payments were personal and not relevant. But the judge leaned forward, his voice sharp. "They're relevant if she's claiming poverty while sending money elsewhere," he said. Alyssa's head snapped up, her eyes wide, and for the first time, she looked scared, really scared. I didn't feel sorry for her. I couldn't, not after everything. The judge flipped through my folder again, the one I'd given him yesterday. He pulled out the P.O. box form, the one tied to our son's birth certificate, and held it up. "This was filed without the father's knowledge," he said. "Can you explain that?" Janelle tried to call it a mistake, but the judge kept going, pointing out the bank transfers, the hotel receipts, the email about starting fresh. These suggest a plan, he said, and not one that prioritizes the child. The room was dead quiet now, every word like a hammer. Alyssa's hands were shaking, and Janelle's binder stayed closed. She had nothing left to throw at this. Then came the big moment. The judge said he was suspending Alyssa's custody claim, effective immediately, pending a full CPS investigation. He ordered an audit of her finances and a review of all documents she'd submitted, saying there were serious concerns about their legitimacy. My heart was racing, but I kept my face still, my hands flat on the table. The judge looked at me, his eyes softer than before. "Mr. Rowan," he said, "CPS will work with you to arrange temporary custody, assuming their evaluation checks out. Are you prepared for that?" I nodded, my voice almost breaking. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm ready." He banged his gavel, calling the session closed, and the room started to empty, but I just sat there, letting it sink in. Alyssa didn't move at first, her lawyer whispering urgently, but I didn't care. I stood, grabbing my notepad, and walked out, the hallway feeling brighter than it ever had. Eva caught me outside, handing me a card with her number. "We'll need to do a home visit," she said, "but it's looking good." I thanked her, my voice quiet, and headed for the parking lot. Silas was waiting by my car, his grin wider than yesterday. "Told you," he said, but I didn't have words for it yet. My son wasn't home, not quite, but he was closer than he'd been since that hospital room. I drove back, the road blurring past, thinking about the nursery, about the crib I'd clean out tonight. Alyssa's lies were crumbling, and I was the one standing, ready to pick up the pieces for my boy. The courtroom was packed today, more than it had been before, like word had spread that something big was going down. I sat at my table, my hands steady but my chest tight, knowing this was it. The final hearing, the one where the judge would decide everything. The air smelled like dust and tension, and the hum of whispers from the back row felt like static in my ears. Alyssa was there, sitting with Janelle Carver, but she looked different now, smaller, her face pale, her eyes darting around like she was waiting for a trap to spring. Her lawyer's binder was open, but it wasn't the confident stack of papers it used to be. I didn't look at her for long. My focus was on the judge's bench, on the moment I'd been fighting for since that empty crib stared back at me months ago. Judge Kerr walked in, his robes heavy with purpose, and the room stood, then settled into silence. He didn't bother with preamble, just opened a file, thicker than my folder now, probably stuffed with CPS reports and whatever else he'd been reviewing. "We're here to resolve the custody and support matters," he said, his voice carrying that weight I'd come to recognize. "I've reviewed all submissions, including new information from Child Protective Services and financial audits." My stomach tightened, but I kept my face still, my hands flat on the table. This was the moment, the one I'd poured everything into, every late night, every receipt, every call to Silas and Priya. It was all leading here. The judge started with CPS. Eva Reinhardt wasn't in the room, but her report was, and he summarized it. My son had been with Alyssa's cousin, Tara, since shortly after the hospital, with no evidence Alyssa had been involved in his care. Tara had no legal authority, no paperwork, and the house wasn't even set up for a baby. No crib, no formula, just a makeshift setup in a spare room. CPS had interviewed neighbors, who said Alyssa hadn't been seen in weeks. The judge's voice stayed even, but his words were sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. "This raises serious concerns about parental fitness," he said, glancing at Alyssa's table. Janelle stood, trying to interrupt, saying something about temporary arrangements and misunderstandings, but the judge raised a hand. "You'll have your turn," he said, and she sat, her face tight. Then came the finances. The judge held up a report from the court's auditor, someone I'd never met, but who'd clearly been busy. Alyssa's bank records, ones I hadn't even seen, showed regular deposits from an unknown source, funneled through that Venmo account I'd found, the one linked to Darian Locke. The judge didn't say his name, but he didn't have to. "These transactions contradict claims of financial hardship," he said, his eyes on Alyssa now. "Money was available, yet none appears to have been used for the child's care." I could hear Janelle whispering to Alyssa, urgent and low, but Alyssa didn't respond, just stared at the table, her hands clenched so hard her knuckles were white. The judge moved to my folder next, the one I'd handed over days ago. He listed the pieces, bank transfers, the P.O. box, the hotel receipts, that email about starting fresh. These suggest a deliberate effort to conceal intentions, he said, and to misrepresent circumstances to this court. Deliberate. The word hung in the air, heavy and final. Janelle tried again, standing to say the documents were unverified and my motives were vindictive, but the judge cut her off. The evidence speaks for itself, he said, and for the first time, I saw Alyssa flinch like she'd been hit. I didn't feel triumph, not exactly, just a quiet relief that someone else was finally seeing the truth. Then he got to the ruling. My heart was pounding, but I kept still, my eyes on the judge. On the matter of custody, he said, I'm awarding full physical custody to the father, pending final CPS approval. Full custody. The words hit like a wave, washing over me, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. He kept going, legal custody would be shared for now, but Alyssa's access would be restricted, supervised visits only, until she completed a court-ordered evaluation. Psychological and financial, he said, to determine her capacity and intent. I heard a gasp from her table, but I didn't look. I couldn't. My son was coming home. That was all that mattered. The judge moved to child support next. The request for support is denied, he said, his voice firm. No credible evidence supports the claim of need, and questions remain about the mother's financial conduct. Denied. Another weight lifted, not because of the money, but because it meant her lies hadn't worked. The judge added one more thing. Alyssa was to cover court costs, and any future filings would require pre-approval to prevent frivolous claims. It was a warning, clear as day, and the room felt it. He closed his file, looked at both tables, and said, This court expects honesty. When that's absent, consequences follow. Then he banged his gavel, and it was over. The room erupted, not loud, but a ripple of movement, whispers, chairs scraping. Alyssa broke down, her shoulders shaking, her voice a low sob as she leaned into Janelle. Please, she said, loud enough for me to hear. I just need another chance. The judge was already standing, ready to leave, but he paused, looking at her. You've had chances, he said, then walked out. The back row was silent now, no laughter, no smirks. I stayed in my seat for a moment, letting it sink in. Full custody. My son, coming home. I didn't gloat, didn't smile. I just gathered my notepad, stood, and walked to the clerk to collect the paperwork, temporary orders, CPS instructions, a schedule for the home visit. It was real now, not just a hope. I stepped into the hallway, the sunlight harsh through the windows. Silas was waiting, leaning against a wall, his grin softer than usual. You did it, he said, but I just nodded, still processing. Priya texted me, she'd been stuck at work, but wanted to know everything. I'd call her later, tell her the details, but right now, I needed to move. I drove home, the paperwork on the passenger seat, my hands steady on the wheel. The house was quiet when I got there, but it didn't feel empty anymore. I went to the nursery, opened the door, and stood there, picturing him, his crib, his little hands, the life we'd have. Alyssa's tears didn't matter. Her lies didn't matter. What mattered was him, and he was mine now, legally, finally. I closed the door, ready to clean, to prepare, to make this house a home again. The morning light slipped through the kitchen window, soft and warm, painting the counter in shades of gold I hadn't noticed in months. I stood at the stove, flipping pancakes, the smell of butter and batter filling the air. The apartment was new, smaller than the old house, but it felt right, clean, open, mine. In the next room, my son was sleeping, his tiny breath steady through the baby monitor on the counter. I checked on him twice already, just to be sure he was there, his little chest rising and falling in the crib I'd set up last night. It was his first morning here, his first real day home, and I was moving slow, letting every moment sink in. The world outside could wait. Right now, it was just us, and that was enough. Yesterday's court ruling still echoed in my head, full custody, support denied, Alyssa's lies laid bare for everyone to see. I hadn't let myself celebrate then, not really. There'd been too much to do, signing papers, meeting with Eva from CPS, getting the apartment ready for the home visit. But now, with the quiet hum of the morning around me, I could feel it, relief, deep and heavy, like a knot finally coming undone. I wasn't the guy who'd woken up to an empty hospital room anymore. Wasn't the guy who'd stood in a silent nursery wondering where his kid was. I was a father, my son's father, and he was here, safe, where he belonged. The pancakes sizzled, and I slid them onto a plate, not because I was hungry, but because it felt normal, like something a dad would do. The move to this place had happened fast. After the judge's decision, I'd realized the old house wasn't home anymore. Too many ghosts, too many memories of Alyssa's betrayal. I'd found this apartment a week ago, a two-bedroom with big windows and a park nearby. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough for us, enough to start over. I'd spent last night unpacking, setting up the crib, hanging a mobile with little stars that spun when I tapped it. Priya had come by to help, bringing a bag of baby clothes and a bottle of wine we didn't open. "You're gonna be fine," she'd said, her voice soft but sure, and I believed her. Silas had texted, too, just a quick, "proud of you, man," that hit harder than I expected. They'd both been there, every step, but this part, the quiet mornings, the daily stuff, that was on me now. I turned off the stove and glanced at the monitor. Still sleeping. I'd named him Caleb, back in the hospital, before everything fell apart. Alyssa hadn't argued, just nodded like it didn't matter. Now, saying his name in my head felt like claiming him all over again. Caleb. My boy. I walked to his room, easing the door open, and stood there, watching him. He was so small, his hands curled into fists, his face peaceful in a way that made my chest ache. I'd missed so much, his first weeks, his first sounds, but I was here now, and I wasn't going anywhere. I closed the door softly and went back to the kitchen, the pancakes cold but waiting, like a promise of more mornings like this. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It used to be, back in the old house, when every creak felt like a reminder of what I'd lost. Now, it was calm, full of possibility. I sat at the table, a small one I'd bought secondhand, and pulled out my phone. There were messages, Priya asking how the first night went, my boss checking if I needed more time off. I'd taken a few days to settle in, but work was waiting, and I was ready to get back to it. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to build something steady for Caleb, something he could count on. I typed quick replies, then set the phone down, letting the quiet wrap around me again. I thought about Alyssa, just for a second. Not the courtroom version, all tears and excuses, but the woman I'd married, the one who'd laughed at my bad jokes and planned a nursery with me. That person was gone, maybe never real, and I didn't miss her anymore. The judge had ordered evaluations, financial, psychological, before she could even think about seeing Caleb again. Part of me wondered if she'd try, if she'd fight to come back into his life, but I didn't let it linger. She'd made her choices, Darien Locke, the lies, the P.O. box, all of it, and I'd made mine. Mine was here, in this apartment, with a kid who needed me more than she ever did.